Every civilization that has collapsed in recorded history believed it possessed sacred texts.
Right.
Like, think about the sheer scale of that for a second. You look at ancient Egypt, which is arguably one of the most durable empires in human history, and, what did they rely on? The Book of the Dead.
Exactly.
Which was, it was essentially a highly elaborate cheat code to bypass the judgment of the gods. And then you pivot to Rome, the ultimate administrative...
The ultimate military machine.
Yeah, exactly. Military machine. And at the core of their statecraft, they had the Sibylline books and the auguries, literally cutting open birds to read their entrails to decide whether or not to launch a military campaign.
Wild to think about.
It is. And then jump forward to medieval Europe, right? An era entirely defined by papal bulls, holy relics, and manuscripts kept under lock and key. All of these incredible, massive empires.
Pinnacles of human organization at the time.
Exactly. They treated their foundational texts as repositories of supernatural signals. They viewed them as lucky charms, like magical wards designed to keep the empire safe from collapse. Yet, they all collapsed anyway.
The architecture failed.
The architecture entirely failed.
Yeah.
So when you're studying the history of human survival, the question isn't whether a community possesses a book. That's a given.
Yeah.
The real question, the defining question that determines whether a society lives or dies, is what that community thinks the book is actually for.
And that framing right there, it completely upends how we traditionally approach historical and sociological analysis.
Totally.
Because if a community treats foundational text as a collection of spells or, a talisman, they're interacting with it strictly on a level of superstition. They're basically asking the text to do the work of reality for them.
Right. Protect us magically.
Exactly. But if they treat it as an operational manual, like an engineered system of laws and societal mechanics, well, then they're interacting with it on a level of civilizational survival. And today we were doing a deep dive into an incredibly analytical lecture by G.A. Parwes.
Yes, focusing on the very first verse.
The first verse of the 25th chapter of the Quran, a surah named Al-Furqan. And right out of the gate, like verse 1, this analysis reframes the entire purpose of the text.
So unpack the name for us, because the standard English translation of Al-Furqan is usually rendered as the Criterion.
Right, the Criterion. But in the context of systems engineering and sociology, which is our lens today, Criterion barely scratches the surface. We are not looking at a book of mystical signs here. This analysis presents Al-Furqan as an epistemological instrument.
An epistemological instrument?
Yeah, it's a discriminator, a highly calibrated filtering mechanism designed to literally separate what functionally works in a society from what actively destroys it.
And if you miss that framing, in the very first verse, you will systematically misread every single verse that follows.
You'll be totally lost.
You'll be sitting there looking for mystical prophecies or spooky theological threads when you should actually be running civilizational diagnostics.
Exactly.
So that is our mission for this deep dive. We are entirely discarding the lens of theologians debating abstract doctrine. We are putting on the hard hats of sociologists and systems engineers.
I love that. Hard hats on.
We are dissecting what this material presents as a literal manual for human survival. But before we get into the high-level architecture of this discriminator, we have to talk about how easily humanity breaks its own tools.
Oh, man.
Because history is just full of striking and honestly slightly hilarious examples of communities taking incredibly sophisticated technology and completely misunderstanding its purpose.
It really is the ultimate tragedy of human intellectual degradation. You hand a society a text designed to architect a functioning, equitable civilization, and within a few generations, what do? They reduce it to a spell book.
It's so frustrating.
There's this specific, incredibly vivid anecdote in this analysis about people taking verses of this text, reciting them, and then blowing on a comb to try and fix a crooked hair parting.
Wait, literally blowing on a comb?
Literally reciting a verse to fix a bad hair day.
You really have to pause and visualize the absurdity of that. You are holding an epistemological instrument meant to distinguish absolute truth from civilizational collapse, and you're using it to fix your hair.
Right.
It's like discovering a quantum supercomputer and deciding its best use is as a paperweight for your grocery list. Or, using a multi-billion-dollar particle accelerator to dry your damp laundry.
That's the perfect analogy.
It is a complete, fundamental misunderstanding of the technology you have in your hands. You're turning a sociological blueprint into a magic trick.
And that magic trick mentality, it extends way beyond personal vanity. It infects the entire social calendar. Like, consider the celebration of Shab-e-Barat,
Okay.
which many communities treat as this magical night of destiny. They fill the sky with fireworks, they distribute sweets, and they operate under this belief that their fate for the entire coming year is being mystically written that very night.
But when you actually look at the text,
Exactly. When you run a historical diagnostic on this practice, it has absolutely zero basis in the text itself. It's a cultural adoption. It's almost certainly rooted in ancient Zoroastrian traditions like Naros, where fears were lit and destinies were supposedly decided by the flames.
wow.
So what you are witnessing is a community taking a text filled with rigorous socioeconomic instructions and just replacing its application with fireworks and superstition. They entirely divorce the text from its practical operational purpose.
So the obvious question, the one any sociologist has to ask, is why? Why do human beings do this so consistently across time and geography? Why do we take the quantum supercomputer and use it as a paperweight? Because it actually requires active effort to ignore the instructions and invent a fireworks festival instead.
It does. And the analysis diagnoses the root cause perfectly. It's the herd instinct. Or, in the Arabic terminology used in the text, it's called taqlid.
Taqlid, okay.
Human communities have this natural, almost gravitational pull toward accepting unproven assertions, provided those assertions come with sufficient social authority.
Like peer pressure on a civilizational scale.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of social contagion. If the high priest says it, if the king endorses it, or, perhaps most powerfully, if your ancestors practiced it for hundreds of years, the herd instinct dictates that it must be true.
Right. It bypasses the critical faculties entirely.
It's not reasoning. It's biological and sociological mimicry.
Because thinking is calorically expensive and socially dangerous. Like, if you are the one zebra who decides to run left while the rest of the herd runs right, you usually get eaten by the lion.
Yep. You don't survive.
So the herd instinct means you aren't looking at the path ahead to see if it leads off a cliff. You're just staring at the heels of the person immediately in front of you and matching their stride.
Precisely. The herd provides this false sense of security through sheer numbers. And this is exactly why the foundational text we are looking at explicitly and repeatedly counters this instinct with a specific phrase.
Which is?
It translates to so that you may use reason. But, in this context, reason isn't just some passive intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
It is a disruptive technology.
I love that framing. Disruptive technology.
Yeah. The entire architecture of the text is designed to elevate the human intellect above the herd instinct. It is a direct, targeted intervention against social contagion. It demands that you physically and mentally step out of the herd, and actively evaluate the assertions being handed down to you by your ancestors or your leaders.
Okay, so to break free from the gravitational pull of the herd, we need a specific tool. We need this discriminator we mentioned. Let's really look at the linguistic architecture of this tool, because the words used in just the very first verse of this chapter, Surah Al-Furqan, are engineered with incredible precision. Like, the chapter is named after the concept itself. Let's break down the root of this word, Furqan.
Right. So in Arabic, the root of Furqan is farq. And farq means a distinct absolute separation.
Okay.
The analysis uses a very grounding physical analogy here, which ironically relates back to the hair parting we were laughing about earlier.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, farq is like a perfectly straight parting of hair that separates one side of the head from the other with absolute, undeniable clarity.
So there's no gradient.
None. There is no gray area or ambiguity. It is a precise filtering mechanism. When we talk about Al-Furqan as a sociological tool, it isn't just offering a vague philosophical sense of right and wrong. It is an instrument that creates a sharp, uncompromising boundary between two mutually exclusive operational states.
It's a binary sorting algorithm. It categorizes actions, laws, and institutions into what works and what fails. But then we hit the second major concept in this verse, and this is where standard translations usually do a massive disservice to the text. The word is tabaraka.
Ah, yes, tabaraka.
If you pick up a standard English translation, you almost always see it rendered as blessed. So the verse reads, "Blessed is he who sent down the Criterion." But reading this through a systems engineering lens, it reveals a radically different, deeply functional meaning for that word. Right?
Hey, absolutely. Translating tabaraka merely as blessed entirely strips it of its operational power. It turns it back into a mystical spell.
Right, back to the paperweight.
Exactly. The analysis explains that tabaraka actually refers to a source that is maximally productive and self-sustaining. It is the exact opposite of a system that extracts, depletes, or decays over time.
Wow.
So when the text uses the word tabaraka, it is establishing the fundamental nature of the system's origin. It is a system that generates capacity. And to really grasp this, we have to look at the two brilliant mechanical analogies provided to illustrate what a self-sustaining system actually looks like in practice.
These analogies are crucial because they move the concept out of the clouds and into physical reality. The first analogy is a firmly rooted tree, but not just, any tree. Think of a massive, ancient tree solidly anchored deep in the earth.
Right.
It doesn't move from its foundational spot, but it is absolutely not static like a rock. A rock is permanent, but it's dead.
Right, it doesn't do anything.
Exactly. This tree continually grows, it adapts to the shifting seasons, it branches out to capture sunlight, and most importantly, it continually bears fruit year after year.
It produces.
Yes, it provides immense compounding benefit to its environment without ever depleting its own foundation. That is what tabaraka means. It is the perfect synthesis of unbreakable stability combined with continuous productive growth.
It is an organic generative system. And the second analogy takes that concept into the realm of human engineering, a door on its hinges.
Ooh, the door analogy is great.
This is where the profound concept of permanence and change is introduced. Think about the mechanics of a door. The hinges are permanently attached to the frame and the foundation, right?
Right.
The foundation is absolute. It does not shift. It does not negotiate. But the door itself, attached to those permanent principles, swings back and forth to serve a highly practical purpose based on the immediate needs of the environment.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah, it opens to facilitate movement and commerce, and it closes to provide security and insulation. It is infinitely adaptable. So the hinges represent the absolute principles of the system, while the swinging door represents the adaptable applications of those principles across different eras and societal conditions.
That distinction is everything. A society cannot survive purely on permanence because that's a fossil, and it cannot survive purely on change because that's chaos.
Exactly. Fossil versus chaos.
So tabaraka is the engineering blueprint that requires both the unbreakable hinges and the swinging door. It's a highly engineered system that possesses rock-solid foundational principles, but retains the flexibility to adapt to changing environments without breaking.
It's a very resilient architecture.
Which brings us to a massive logistical problem. If you have this perfect self-sustaining discriminator, how do you actually implement it? Like, you can't just drop a perfect system onto a deeply flawed society all at once. If you try to force an entirely equitable economic structure onto a deeply entrenched feudal society overnight, you don't get utopia. You get a bloodbath.
You get total systemic failure.
Right. The society fractures under the shock. So how did the system account for the human inability to change instantaneously?
That is precisely what the third crucial word in the verse addresses. The word is nazala, usually translated simply as sent down, right? But the verb form here is highly specific and mechanically intentional. Nazala implies a gradual, staged, and meticulously calibrated delivery. It strictly negates the idea of a sudden, overwhelming drop of information or instantaneous systemic overhaul.
It's a software rollout.
Yes, a software rollout.
If you have a massive new operating system, you don't just force it onto millions of disparate devices globally at the exact same second. If you do that, you crash the existing hardware, the legacy systems fail, the infrastructure burns down, and nobody can communicate.
You'd brick the whole system.
Exactly. Instead, you deploy it in stages. You release a module, you let the system adapt, you patch the vulnerabilities, and then you release the next module. You match the rollout strictly to the receiving community's capacity to absorb it, test it, and implement it without catastrophic failure.
That is the exact mechanism of Nazala. The Furqan, this civilizational discriminator, it was introduced incrementally. The human hardware of the 7th century, the society receiving it, they needed time to process and apply the absolute principles. It was calibrated deployment. They had to untangle their existing dysfunctions step by step so they wouldn't completely collapse under the sheer weight of total sudden change. The delivery mechanism was as perfectly engineered as the system itself.
Okay, so we have established the architecture. We have a highly sophisticated, self-sustaining discriminator, tabaraka, perfectly designed to sort functional reality from dysfunction, which is Furqan, and carefully rolled out to humanity in manageable stages, nazala.
You've got it.
But why do we need this external discriminator so badly in the first place? Why can't human beings just sit down, think really hard, and figure out what's good and bad on our own?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. And this brings us to what the analysis identifies as the ultimate epistemological crisis. The total failure of human philosophy to anchor the concepts of good and evil.
This is the core civilizational problem the Furqan is engineered to solve. In the terminology of the text, these concepts are care, which is good, versus shar, which is evil. And operationally, that translates to haq, truth, versus batil, falsehood. And if we look at human history, specifically starting with the ancient Greeks, we see a continuous, spectacular failure to define these terms objectively. Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, they dedicated their lives to debating the nature of the good.
But they couldn't nail it down.
Right, because they were relying solely on human intellect and observation. They can never find an absolute anchor outside of human perception. Without an external, objective discriminator, human philosophy inevitably decays into relative truth.
We really need to drill down into the mechanics of relative truth because, it sounds sophisticated in a university seminar, but in practice, it is a mechanism for absolute tyranny.
Totally.
When truth is relative, it is completely dependent on human necessity. And the brutal reality of the tyranny of necessity is that when a group of humans need something badly enough, they possess the psychological hardware to justify absolutely any atrocity.
Exactly. When you remove the absolute discriminator, society has to rely on utilitarian needs or secular laws, and those shift constantly depending on who holds power. Let's look at how this plays out functionally. A society might universally agree in peacetime that lying and deception are fundamentally bad. But what happens when that society enters a conflict, or when a massive corporation faces bankruptcy?
The rules change.
Suddenly, the relative truth shifts. Lying is no longer a moral failing. It is rebranded as strategic disinformation necessary for national security or fiduciary duty necessary for shareholder value. The action hasn't changed, but the relative framework has justified it.
And you can scale that up to the most horrific extremes. Murder is universally condemned by every functioning society. But under the guise of necessity, a tribe or a nation-state will justify mass murder as preemptive defense, or historical revenge, or manifest destiny.
Right.
We see this in economics all the time. A system where a fraction of a percent of the population hoards immense wealth while millions starve is clearly dysfunctional. But those hoarding the wealth justify it through the relative truth of market efficiency or rewarding innovation. When truth is relative, the rules only apply until they become inconvenient for the people writing them.
To understand how humans achieve this level of self-deception, the analysis incorporates the philosophical framework of Allama Iqbal. He perfectly categorized the mechanics of the human mind into two distinct types of intellect.
Okay, let's unpack those.
The first is Aqli Kudbin. This translates to the rationalizing intellect.
The rationalizing intellect, I think everyone listening knows exactly what this voice sounds like.
Oh, yeah.
This is the incredibly articulate lawyer living inside your head that comes up with perfectly logical-sounding excuses for why you should act in your own self-interest. It's the voice that tells you why it's actually totally fine that you cut someone off in traffic because you're running late, even though you'd be furious if they did it to you.
Right.
It is fundamentally, intrinsically selfish.
It is entirely self-centered.
Yeah.
And it scales up from the individual to the empire. The rationalizing intellect only perceives its own immediate benefit or the benefit of its specific in-group or tribe.
So it's basically the engine of justification.
Exactly. Its primary function is to construct complex, rational-sounding arguments to justify extracting resources, labor, or dignity from others in order to sustain itself. In the terminology of our text, the rationalizing intellect is the primary engine of Batil, falsehood.
So if the rationalizing intellect is the engine of falsehood, what is the countermeasure? How do we build an engine of truth?
The countermeasure is what Iqbal calls Aql-e Janbin, the guiding intellect. This is the intellect strictly aligned with the principles of revelation, the Furqan.
Okay.
This intellect operates on a macro level. It sees the universal picture. It refuses to justify actions based on localized necessity or tribal advantage. And this is the critical juncture where the definitions of haq and batil stop being philosophical and become purely operational.
Like mechanically operational.
Yes. In this framework, haq, which we loosely translate as truth, is not an abstract floating theological concept you ponder in a monastery. Haq is what is functionally real. It is the system, the law, or the action that produces universal human flourishing and capacity.
If we tie this back to the tree analogy, haq is the system that allows the tree to grow deeper roots and bear fruit that nourishes everyone. not just the person who planted it. It generates capacity.
Exactly. And conversely, Batil, falsehood, is not just telling a lie. Batil is structural dysfunction.
Okay, unpack that. Structural dysfunction.
It is any system, institution, or behavior that extracts from others, creates social friction, and inevitably collapses when it is stress-tested by reality.
Wow.
The rationalizing intellect constantly builds Batil systems like feudalism or hyper-extractive capitalism or authoritarian dictatorships because they beautifully serve the immediate needs of the few in power. But because they are Batil, because they defy functional reality, they ultimately fail the stress test and collapse, just like the ancient empires we discussed at the beginning.
Which perfectly transitions us to the logistics of how this system was actually delivered to humanity. We are back in verse 1 of Al-Furqan. We've unpacked the discriminator, Furqan, the self-sustaining nature of it, Tabaraka, and its calibrated deployment, Nazala. Now, we have to zero in on the exact nature of the delivery mechanism. The verse uses the word abdihi, his servant. The messenger bringing this incredible epistemological instrument is explicitly, forcefully identified as an abdian, a fully human agent.
This specific word is a masterclass in systems engineering. And the analysis places immense weight on it because it is load-bearing for the entire structural integrity of the text.
Load-bearing, I like that.
Yeah. The messenger is not an angel. He is not a demigod. He is a fully biological human agent operating within the exact same physical, economic, and sociological constraints as every other human being on the planet.
Yeah.
There is zero supernatural elevation. There is no divine exemption from the consequences of his own actions or the laws of physics.
Now, if I am putting myself in the shoes of someone trying to establish a new world order, I have to push back on this design choice.
Sure.
If you are delivering a system that claims to be the absolute universal truth for all of humanity, wouldn't it command vastly more authority if it was delivered by a glowing supernatural being? Like if a being made of light descended from the sky and handed us the laws of physics, we would all obey instantly. Wouldn't a divine messenger be infinitely more effective?
It seems logical on the surface, but a deeper systems analysis reveals a catastrophic flaw in that thinking. If the messenger were divine, or if he possessed any supernatural exemption from the laws of reality, the entire system he is delivering would instantly collapse into a privileged structure.
A privileged structure. Break down the mechanics of that. Why does divinity break the system?
It comes down to a concept called mukafat amal, the law of requital.
Law of requital.
This is the universal law of cause and effect in the human sphere. It dictates that every single action has a perfectly corresponding consequence. Now, if the messenger bringing the rules is somehow above this law, if he doesn't have to eat or sleep or face economic hardship or feel physical pain,
then the rules don't really apply to him.
Exactly. Then the law is no longer universal. It becomes a set of rules for the presence, enforced by a king who doesn't have to follow them.
Oh, wow.
By explicitly defining the messenger as an a mortal human being entirely embedded in the causal network of reality, the text provides an ironclad guarantee that the system is real, operational, and achievable for everyone. It proves this is not special pleading for a clerical class or an elite ruling structure.
The genius of that is undeniable. If a supernatural entity that doesn't require sustenance tells me I need to be patient and uphold justice during a severe famine, my immediate response is going to be easy for you to say, you don't have biology. You don't feel starvation.
Exactly.
But if the messenger is a human being, starving right next to me in the dirt, and he is still successfully upholding the absolute principles of the system without breaking, that is empirical proof. It proves the system functions under the harshest human constraints.
Exactly. It provides the empirical data that the system is viable. And the analysis astutely points out that virtually every other major belief system in human history has failed, precisely because, over time, the followers succumbed to the herd instinct and elevated their human founders to divine status.
Right, they deified them.
Yes. By deifying their founders, they effectively removed them from the very causal laws they were supposed to be modeling. They turned a functional, reproducible human exemplar into an unreachable magical deity, which meant the actual system of laws became impossible for a normal human to follow.
That is such a profound historical tragedy. By trying to honor the messenger too much, by turning him into a god, they actually destroyed the machine he handed them.
They broke the technology.
They broke the technology.
Yeah.
Okay, this leads us into the final sweeping section of our deep dive. We have this discriminator, It's grounded in absolute truth, carefully deployed, and empirically proven by a human agent subject to universal laws. And the final word of this first verse seals the entire architecture. Little Alameen.
Nadhira lil alamin, a warner or a criterion for all worlds.
Plural. Worlds. Universal. The analysis is remarkably firm on this point. This single word immediately and permanently demolishes any claim of tribal, national, or racial ownership over this text.
Right.
It is not the proprietary, copyrighted document of 7th century Arabs.
It cannot be, by definition.
Yeah.
If the discriminator is truly based on functional reality, on what objectively works to produce human capacity and flourishing, then the laws of that reality must apply to all human systems, across all of time and all of geography.
Like the laws of physics.
Exactly. Just as the laws of aerodynamics apply equally in Tokyo, New York, and ancient Rome, the sociological laws of Hack and Batil are universal. The moment a specific community points to this text and claims, "This is our special book, only for us," they're instantly reverting back to the herd instinct.
Wow.
They're destroying the universality of the Furqan and turning it back into a tribal talisman.
And the historical record provides an event that served as the ultimate performance test for this exact claim of universality. We aren't just talking about a theoretical debate in a courtyard. We are talking about a brutal, visceral, historical stress test, the Battle of Badr.
Right. The Battle of Badr is traditionally narrated as a simple historical skirmish between two armies. But through the lens of this analysis, Badr is the ultimate crucible. It is the exact moment in human history where the Furqan was stress-tested to its absolute limit.
Okay, how so?
This was the moment where ideological bonds, the commitment to the universal system of Hack, had to completely and physically supersede biological bonds.
And biology is the deepest, oldest herd instinct we have, right? The pull to protect your tribe, your DNA, your blood, that is hardwired into our evolutionary biology.
It is the strongest instinct in the human animal. But at the Battle of Badr, the historical record shows us something unprecedented. We see Abu Bakr standing on the battlefield facing his own biological son on the opposing side.
His own...
We see Umar facing his own uncle. These men had to make a real-time, life-or-death decision to physically sever their biological ties for the sake of functional, systemic reality. They had to actively use the Furqan as a discriminator to separate truth from falsehood, even when falsehood was standing across the battlefield wearing the face of their own flesh and blood.
That is an incredibly heavy reality to process, but it was absolutely necessary. That was the moment they proved the system wasn't just a nice utopian philosophy to discuss over tea in the afternoon.
But far from it.
It was an absolute operational principle that they were willing to uphold, even when it demanded the ultimate personal biological sacrifice. It proved the system could survive maximum psychological and physical pressure without compromising its core architecture.
And that profound level of commitment ties directly into the true functional meaning of the word natir, which is the action the Furqan performs for all worlds. It's usually translated as warner.
Right, and the problem with the translation warner is the cultural baggage it carries. When we hear warner, we immediately picture a guy standing on a street corner with a cardboard sign and a megaphone shouting that the end of the world is nigh.
Yeah.
It sounds like a spooky theological threat, like, do this or the sky will fall on you.
But the analysis strips away that spooky theology and redefines natir in a completely practical, mechanical way. It is not a threat of mystical doom. A natir is the red warning light on your car's dashboard telling you the engine is overheating.
Ah, okay.
It is the bright yellow sign on the highway that says bridge out ahead. It is an objective indicator pointing out a fatal flaw or a pitfall in the mechanics of how society is operating.
So it's not threatening you. It's providing you with critical telemetry data.
Yes.
It's a diagnostic alert saying, if you continue to drive your civilization down this road of relative truth extraction and tribalism, you are mathematically guaranteed to hit a wall and collapse.
Exactly. The analysis uses a very specific psychological term here, describing how ignoring these systemic warnings inevitably leads to a suffocation of human potential. Yeah. When a society operates on the basis of Batil, when it builds its architecture on falsehood, extraction, and the rationalizing intellect, it creates a deep, pervasive, psychological, and systemic suffocation. The natir is the diagnostic mechanism that points out the dangers so humanity can course correct, breathe, grow, and bear fruit, like that firmly rooted tree we discussed earlier.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today, and we've only been looking at the implications of a single verse.
This is verse 1.
Let's synthesize the core mechanics of what we've uncovered. The standing instruction of this entire deep dive into the first verse of Al-Furqan is that before the text gets to a single specific rule, before it tells you how to trade or govern or organize, it completely establishes the epistemological foundation for everything. It hands you a tool.
A highly calibrated discriminator, and the implicit instruction is that you must actively use it.
Yes. It demands that you take this discriminator and apply it to every institution, every law, every corporate structure, and every social arrangement you encounter. You must constantly ask, does this architecture produce capacity? Right? Does it create hack, functional reality, and universal flourishing? Or does this system deplete and extract from humanity to serve a few? Is it Batil?
And the observable pattern of civilizational history, as this entire analysis argues, is binary. Communities that apply this discriminator, that use reason to overcome the herd instinct and adapt absolute principles to changing times, well, they survive and develop.
And the ones that don't?
Those that abandon it, relying instead on superstition, magical thinking, or relative self-serving truths, inevitably accumulate systemic dysfunction. The architecture of their society weakens, the foundations rot, until it ultimately fails the stress test of reality.
Which brings us right back to the very beginning. The collapsed empires of Egypt, Rome, and medieval Europe. They possessed the texts, but they failed the diagnostic stress test because they thought the texts were magic. So I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up. I want you to look around at the modern systems you interact with every single day. Look critically at our massive corporate structures. Listen to the rhetoric of our political discourse. Examine the foundations of our global economic models. If we were to plug the Furqan diagnostic tool into our modern world right now, strictly distinguishing the hack that sustains human capacity from the Batil that extracts from it, what red warning lights are flashing on our civilizational dashboard right this very second? And the real question, the one that will determine if our civilization survives or becomes another layer of ruins, are we actually brave enough to read the signs and change course?